And thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining. And for those of you, if you did not take advantage of the Eat Engage offer, we did drop a message in the Zoom chat here. You still have time to order a gift card before the session ends if you'd like to. So again, welcome and thanks for joining our webinar here on budgeting and planning solutions that replace Excel. Today, we're going to focus specifically on one tool, which is called Martus. That is a very popular and affordable tool in the budgeting and planning space. So our agenda for today, welcome and housekeeping. We'll talk about why you would look at a tool like this and signs that you need more than standard plain old Excel-based budgeting. We'll do a live demo of Martus, which will hopefully be the majority of our time together. And we also have time for Q&A. Now, all throughout the session, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A and we'll look at those throughout the session as we go. And if there's anything that we don't get to during the session, we will get back to you separately. My name is Jim Norton, and I am the head of our Accounting Technology Services division here at GRF. And I manage and work with all of the partnerships that we have for accounting technology, from ERP systems like Intact and Acumatica, all the way to budgeting and planning systems, payroll, time and expense, AP automation, AR automation, grants management, probably a few others that I haven't rattled off the top of my head. But we have a lot of partnerships, and we do that so that you can have one place to go for every type of accounting related technology that you need, and we can help you to solve all of the challenges that you're facing. So a little bit of background before we get into this. This is an intro of what we will and will not talk about today. So today we're going to talk about the challenges that organizations are facing related to financial planning and analysis, or FP&A. We're going to talk about the risks of what most organizations are doing, especially at the start, which is using Excel and only Excel for that function. We're going to talk about a solid and affordable option for a modern FP&A tool that is cloud-based. We're going to talk about the value that that brings. What we're not going to talk about today is how much does it cost, right? Because cost, whenever you have something that is anything other than a software you go buy off the shelf at Costco, is not something that we can determine for every organization right on the spot. We need to think about what the things are that you need, what modules do you need, how many users do you need, and there's a lot of variables that go into figuring that out. So we're not going to talk about that today. Just know that Martus, which is the option that we're talking about, is widely considered to be one of the most affordable options that there is. So what I'm going to dive into now is the signs that you've outgrown Excel-based budgeting and planning. And hopefully a lot of what I talk about on this next slide is going to seem familiar to you all, and that's probably why you're here. And I think this graphic really sums it up. I used to break this up into like 8 or 9 different slides, but I found a way to combine it into this one graphic that represents the challenges that everyone is facing when they use only a spreadsheet approach to manage their budgeting and planning. And basically what happens is you're caught in an endless loop where you are preparing your budgets in Excel, preparing any forecasts or models or projections in Excel, and then you're doing it over and over and over again anytime you need another scenario. Right? So you get caught in this trap of downloading data, copying and pasting it into the format you want to use for budgeting, breaking that data out so that people can only work with the part of the data that you want them to see and have access to, then rolling that data back together so that you could look at your whole organization. In between all of that, you're building models, so supporting schedules that are going to help you figure out, how did I come up with this number? For example, maybe you want to plan out travel and training costs, and you have several inputs that go into that, such as the number of staff who are going to be traveling. What is the rate that we expect their daily travel costs to be? Or if they're going to a training, what is the rate that we expect their registration to be for that training? So there's a lot of quantities and variables that go into that you often figure out off to the side in some separate Excel tab, which is linked with a formula that probably broke somewhere along the way and somebody just didn't notice. Right. So there's a big accuracy and reliability of your data risk when you do that. Then you're going to have to, at some point, measure that budget against your actual results, because that's a very large part of the reason that we even do budgeting and planning, so that we can take that budget data and compare it against our actuals and see where we're on track and off track and what we do about it. Well, the problem is when you're doing all of this in Excel, you have all these problems that go on around the perimeter of this slide in these different stop sign looking logos, right? So you have things like formula errors. So you see this pound sign or hashtag ref error in a lot of your sheets if something breaks or if somebody makes an error. As you're passing this data around and giving people all their different pieces of their Excel-based budget, you run the risk of data security, privacy risk, and also knowledge transfer regarding how that sheet is even built and how it works and what it's supposed to do. Right? So you run that risk when you're working in plain old Excel. As you're sitting there breaking up the budget into all its different pieces and then putting it back together again, the process of doing something like that takes time. So all the time that you're spending to have to rip your data up and then staple it back together is giving you this risk of errors, and it's giving you a time lag. And the longer financial information sits stagnant or unusable, the less useful it becomes, the longer that it's taking to get that in people's hands to analyze and make decisions. And overall, somebody sitting there doing this and pulling apart and putting back together a bunch of different separate Excel sheets is not a really high value use of those people's time and effort. And I bet that most people are not so robustly staffed that they have the luxury of somebody having that be their only job, right? So really this is competing with somebody's ability to do however many other things you would have them do instead if they didn't have to do all this manual work. And then in the heart of all of this, so all these problems going around on the perimeter, all of the activities that you're doing when you go a layer into this circle, downloading and so forth, are going on. And then when you get into the middle of this, which is scenario management and what if, meaning that I've got one version of my budget, but what happens if this program goes away? Or what happens if a new program goes on? What happens if I decide to hold a new conference? Things like that. Those are all scenario management and what if. And when you're doing that in an Excel-based world, that usually means a whole nother Excel file where you're doing all this work over and over and over again. And comparing them against each other means probably yet another Excel file where you try to merge them together. So it gets really painful, and it doesn't give you the ability to be a nimble, agile organization. So with that, that's all I really want to say about the challenges. I'm sure many of you can relate to some or all of those challenges on this slide, but I want to spend the majority of our time together today showing you a solution that solves it, which is Martus. Right? So with Martus, you move from offline schedules to a cloud-based modern approach. Right? It is a cloud-based budgeting and planning tool. It's integrated with multiple accounting systems, including Intact, QuickBooks Desktop and Online, Abila MIP, and there are a few others. And then if your accounting software does not support the direct API integration with Martus, it always has import-export capability that's very easy to use. And before we dive into that demo, let's forget about Martus for a second and just think about if you are setting out on this path to try to find a budgeting and planning solution that's right for your organization, what are the traits that you should be looking for in that solution? Now, Martus solves all of these. That's kind of why we're going to be talking about Martus at the end of this in the demo. But before you even look at any particular solution, these are the traits that you should expect in a best-in-class budgeting and planning solution. So things like restricting data visibility to team members on a need-to-know basis prevents you having to subdivide out all these separate Excel files and then put them together, because you just got security that makes it impossible for people to get into what they shouldn't get into. You should be able to do modeling calculation inside the tool so that you don't need an offline Excel schedule to calculate a number that you type into a budgeting solution. Personnel budgeting, we always want that to be tightly controlled. We also want it to be detailed. Multiple versions and revisions, of course, right? So we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we need to have a different version of our budget or plan. Because I know when I was a controller, CFO in the nonprofit world, I was reforecasting sometimes as frequently as monthly, or maybe even a little bit more than that. So that's important. Support for forecasting, collaboration, of course, so that everybody could be working on the same source of truth. It should eliminate, or in the absolute worst case, drastically reduce your reliance on Excel or other spreadsheet tools for budgeting and planning. Other things that you should expect, and this depends on your accounting system more than it does any budgeting and planning system, but you should expect that a budgeting and planning tool should be able to synchronize your chart of accounts and any dimensions or tags that you have in your system that you use for budgeting and reporting. You should expect that it can synchronize actuals from your accounting system. And then you should expect that you would be able to do some level of budget versus actual reporting and analysis within the solution, so that if people may not have access to your accounting system, it doesn't matter, because they can still get that insight that they need in your budgeting and planning or FP&A tool. And as I noted, this is dependent to some extent on the accounting system you use. If you've got a modern cloud-based system that has open APIs, this is very easy to do. If you are on an old school server-based system, it tends to not be as easy to do, but you still have the import-export option if you have a tool like Martus. And then the last note is that the budgeting and planning or FP&A marketplace is very large. And so there's a lot of options. I couldn't possibly talk about every single option that's out there because we would need a very long amount of time to do that. But we believe that Martus is one of the best options in the small mid-market. And another thing that's helpful about Martus is it could be implemented very quickly, could easily be implemented in less than a month. So with that, I'm going to switch gears, and now we're going to look at a demo so that you could see what an experience looks like doing your budgeting and planning inside of Martus. So switching to my web browser, I'm here in my Martus environment as a full admin type user who can do anything and everything that I want. And I'm logged in with a browser. Any browser is fine. I'm a fan of Chrome, so that's what I'm using. And you'll see here, the first place that I've landed when I came into Martus is the welcome page. Now, the welcome page just gives you some snapshots of things that you may be interested in that are coming up. So, if Martus hosts a lot of their own webinars as well, so they give you notifications about what's going on with them, about any updates or releases that they've done recently, any features that are coming up in a beta, for example, they give you insight into that. There are some handy tips on how to do things that you may be wondering how to do. And then if you've saved any reports that you want quick access to, they pop up on this little tile here. The closed month is important, right? So it shows you when the last closed month is, and then they give you a jumping off point to jump right to your dashboards and then look at financials and so forth. So the first part of Martus that I'm going to talk about is the section that's called Planner. And Planner is where all of your budgeting and planning efforts culminate, and you could see the budget or the current plan for your organization. It rolls together here on the summary, rolls together all of the different budgets that people have been putting in for their programs or for their departments or projects or whatever we have, and gives you a holistic view of what the budget looks like for the organization. Now, you do see that this is a calendar year. It can work with a fiscal year as well. My environment just happens to be a calendar year in this example. And since Martus has very granular permission and restriction capability, each user is only going to see what they're allowed to see. So we can filter down the data so that it's relevant and appropriate for them. Right here, as a full admin user, I could see anything and everything that I want. So I've got my different tags or dimensions for my data. I can filter this down to any of the departments I may have, any of the projects or grants that I may have. If I came in as a more restricted user, I would only see maybe the IT department, for example. Maybe that's what I'm allowed to see. So my view would look more like this, and I'd only see what's allowed for my department. But this summary is where all of the work culminates, right? And you'll also see, as you're getting a little glimpse into as I filter this, that we have a lot of pivotability and filtering on the fly on this planner. So just from this one planner screen, I can do a whole lot of things. I can look at different versions of my budget or plan that I may have available. I can look forward or back at different years that I have budget data in here in the system for. I can also change the way that this looks. So if I don't like, for example, that my columns here are months, that doesn't really matter to me. I can change my columns here on the fly. So I could say, you know what, I would prefer to see my projects or grants as my columns. I hit load, and I'm now seeing my projects or grants as my columns. Maybe I don't want the accounts to be going down the rows, but I would rather see a department view summary in the rows. So I can pivot this. And so now I've got a totally different view of my budget data where I've been able to pivot that as I wish. Now I'll take that back to the way it was, to the plain old version, so it's not so wide because I got a lot of projects in here. And there we go. So it's very pivotable, right? And you could set something as a default view for yourself, or if you're the right type of user, like an admin type, you could set a global default view. So lots of pivotability there, which is nice and helpful. The next part of the planner, where a lot of the action actually happens, is called the worksheet section. And in the worksheet section, this is where you break up your budget into the different pieces that people own so that people can work on just what they're responsible for and nothing else. So if somebody, for example, is restricted to only be able to work with Department 120, well, that's all they're going to see, right? And so when they come to this worksheet tab, they're going to have that one and only worksheet. We don't have to worry about parsing out, creating all these separate files, importing them back in, none of that. People just only see what they need to see and they can work with it. And then somebody else will see what they need to see, and it all just works together beautifully. What you see here is that I've got worksheets that define different people's areas of responsibility. These come from your different dimensions or tags in your accounting system. So in my fictitious organization here, the way that I separate responsibility is really by the fund or the entity and the department. So this combination of Fund 100 and Department 100, that's an area that somebody's responsible for, and I've assigned it to them. I can also have one or many approvers, does support approval flow on the budget. So you'll see that in this case, I just have one approver on some of these worksheets, but I could have multiple. Right? So I can define that, who owns it, who approves it, workflow on a worksheet level. So let's click edit next to this first worksheet and take a look at what the experience looks like for somebody working on preparing the budget. And Martus very often releases enhancements to their solution. So right now they're actually in the process of rolling out something called Worksheet 2.0, which is an even better way to prepare your budget data. So I'm going to go ahead and just switch to that Worksheet 2.0, and we will work through that experience. Right. So here you'll see in Worksheet 2.0, I have the ability to see here my actuals for the last year, and I can collapse these sections if I don't care about them. All right, so here I've got my actual income and expense from last year. Maybe I now want to look at what I budgeted for this year. So I've got the different things that I budgeted. I've got a GL account and I've budgeted for a bunch of different grants that are happening in this department. I budgeted for different funders who are funding that work. So that's my income side. And then down on the expense side, I've got, again, some grant level budgets, maybe tagged to a funder. And so that data is all down there. Now, let's say that when I'm looking at this and I want to work on a budget for my department, I want to focus just on budgeting my consultant's expense right now. And that's the only number I want to work on at the moment. Well, because of the filters that we have up here, I can very quickly narrow that down to hone in on what I want to budget. So if I go to filter account here and I start typing consulting, here's my consulting fees GL account, synced over from my accounting system. I didn't have to load anything. So I'm going to select this, and I've now filtered my budget so that I can just work on the consulting fees. When I'm budgeting something, there are a few ways that I can get that data in. So the first way is that I can use what's called the budget widget, and that's actually what I've done on this line. So I'm going to open up this little calculator icon, and this lets me budget however I want. Right. So I could sit here and type numbers into these different monthly boxes if I wanted to do that. What I could also do is I can use this adjustment type over here, which basically says, how frequently does this number occur? Right. So this number that I'm budgeting, how often does it happen? Is it a weekly expense that I'm planning for, a bi-weekly, a monthly, all these different options? Is it annual and I just want to spread it over the year? Do I want to copy things from last year? Right. So there's a lot of different ways that I can come up with that number. In this example, I'm saying that I've got a new consultant. They're going to be paid bi-weekly starting January 2nd. And they're going to get paid on a bi-weekly basis, $2,500. Right. So I can come up with that and I can hit preview. That will show me, based on the number of bi-weekly periods in the year, what the consultant is going to get paid. And you notice here, I've also got a note, right? So if somebody wanted to know what this line is, I could say, this is my consultant. They're bi-weekly for a new grant. And I saved that. So using the budget widget, I've budgeted for a consulting expense. And if somebody hovers over this number, you see the note that's left behind as to what this is. They also see, because this little calculator widget is blue, that's a hint to them. There's something under there, right? So I can click in there, can also see the note that way. I could also say, I want to copy this note to all the following months so that anytime somebody hovers over a number, they're going to see that note again and again and again. So it's an easy way to collaborate and give somebody context as to what that number is that you're budgeting for. So that is one way to do it. Now, let's say that I want to budget things that are not directly financial, but are rather, they're important statistics or KPIs for my organization. Okay, with certain integrations, Martus lets me do that. So for example, let's say that I'm a membership organization and I want to budget a number of new members per month. How would I do that? Well, you could see in the worksheet here, there's a tab for stats or statistics. So if I look at my stats tab and I want to look at just the data I have for a number of members, so I'm going to filter this down again, pick my members, and look at what I've got. So you could see last year I had 15,000 members. Apparently they all happened in January. And right now I don't have a budget yet for the number of new members I'm going to have in 2022. Well, maybe I want to be able to budget that because it's a deeper layer of insight and it helps me to answer questions, right? Because members in a membership organization is going to be a driver of your revenue. So if I'm wondering, why is my revenue up or why is my revenue down? One of the answers to that might be, I have more new members than I thought or less new members than I thought. So I can use the budget widget to come up with the number of members. So what I can do is click this. And again, I could come in and say, I think I'm going to get 15 new members a month. So I preview that. Going to get a total of 180 new members. And that's my budget for my stats, right? So I'm able to budget that and report back on my budget versus actual, depending on the accounting system I have. So as you can see there, the budget widget is a great and helpful way to create a budget. But there's more than that. Like I mentioned in the slides, when we're creating a budget, we often have a model for how we come up with a number. So let's take a common example to make that real. Let's pretend we have travel expense for a grant or a program. Well, when you come up with a model for how you get to that number, you have several different inputs. And in Martus, you have the ability to create what's called a special purpose worksheet, which actually lets you come up with that model and calculate the number that you want to put in your budget. So in my worksheet actions, I could say either create or edit special purpose worksheet. And that's going to take me to my supporting schedule within Martus. And I'm going to be able to come up with my budget. Now I'm going to filter this down to a section that I've got for planning my grant travel. And you'll see here, and we can templatize these too, by the way, which makes it really nice for your non-technical users. So here I've got a model for how I came up with the travel expense for Grant 100. And in that model, I've got a bunch of different assumptions. Things like, what is the meal cost? What is the transportation cost? Lodging, other travel, for example. How many trips are there going to be each month? How many people are going to go on those trips? And then I'm also calculating down here my meals expense, transportation, lodging, travel. So I'm getting very granular because maybe that's the way that I want to budget it in my organization. Each of these lines down here, notice that it's posting, and we could see that it's posting to different GL accounts, right? So I'm budgeting my travel expense by GL account for a grant that's funded by a certain funder. Right? And so I can have all of these assumptions stored within Martus. So that way, if somebody's wondering how I came up with the travel meals expense for Grant 100, they could see the assumptions that went into that. So they could see the meal cost per trip is 400. And there's going to be 4 trips this month and 4 people are going, right? So the math is much clearer than just giving somebody a hard number in a budget and them wondering where it came from. So if you look here inside how I come up with these assumptions, it's kind of the budget widget concept. So if I click inside this line, I could put in what I think, my meal cost per trip is going to be for any given month. If I needed to vary it, during certain months, I could do that very easily. And then I put in my other assumptions here. Now, none of these assumptions are actually going into the budget. They're just support for how I got to a budget number. What goes into the budget is my end result or my calculation. So you could see here, how did I come up with my travel meals expense? If I open this, you're going to see, first of all, that I've directed Martus that the result here should go to this account, travel meals. It should be for this project or grant. It's funded by this funder. Doesn't mean that you have to do it that way. If you don't want to go all the way down to the funder level, this is something that you get to pick, which dimensions or tags in your data are important to you when you're budgeting. So if I look here at the values tab, here you'll see I've got a formula, right? So formulas in Martus, rather than being A4 plus B2, are just plain language, right? So if I needed to rebuild this, all I would have to do is say, I want to take this line, which is my meals cost per trip. I want to multiply it. So if I didn't know the operator, I could find it here. Multiply it times my number of trips per grant. Right, so I'm just picking the lines and it's inserting them for me in plain language. I don't have to worry about really, figuring out A4, B6 and all that kind of stuff that you do in Excel-based planning. And you can make it as complex a formula as you want, by the way. This is a pretty simple formula where I'm just multiplying some things, but you'll notice here in the list, they've got if statements, they've got averages, rounding, right? So greater than or equal to, and so forth. So there's a lot of different formulas that are available to you if you need to build a fancier formula to come up with your calculation. And like I said, worksheets like this can be templatized. So we can create this as a template and roll it out to all of the different projects or programs that are using it so that your end user, by the time they get to this worksheet, they may be coming in and just plugging the assumptions or even just the number of trips and number of attendees, and everything else follows, and it creates the budget pretty seamlessly for them. So once I've put in my assumptions and so forth, and I'm happy with it, I simply click Post to Worksheet, and that is now going to be incorporated into the budget for my department. I can hop back over to the worksheet just by clicking Worksheet. And here you're going to see it takes me back to the worksheet for my department. Now, if I wanted to review that travel expense, so say I'm the approver who's looking at this budget, and I want to go look at the travel expense and figure out what's going on there. So I'll scroll down to some of my travel lines. You'll notice here that this travel expense, which I had just figured out, it's not editable. I can't click into it and mess with it and override it and invalidate all of the support that I just did on the special purpose worksheet, because that would be very frustrating, right? And that would make it so that it would be hard to prove where my budget numbers came from. So when something comes from a special purpose worksheet, otherwise known as like a supporting schedule, I can get to that by clicking this little icon, and it takes me out to the special purpose worksheet. So if I need to make changes to a budget, or if I'm reforecasting, I have to make those changes in here and figure out what is the underlying assumption that I'm changing that's going to change my budget. It's not good enough to just, knock the number down by $5,000 with no explanation. I want to have support, right, for why that's happening and how that's happening. So that's what the special purpose worksheet allows you to do. It really it introduces an element of control and workflow into your budgeting and planning process when you have these numbers that are a little bit more complex than just typing in a monthly amount and calling it a day. So that was the special purpose worksheet. And as you can imagine, it's almost infinitely flexible to model out whatever you want. Now, the last way we're going to cover here is the ability to simply import your budget data. And the worksheet makes this very simple. All you have to do is export your worksheet, fill in the numbers, and import it back in. So if I did have data that I wanted to import for whatever reason, I go to Worksheet Actions and say Export Worksheet. This is going to kick out a version of my budget that is exactly already in the format that I need to import right back into Martus. So when I open up this Excel file, as soon as it's done downloading on my computer here, I may have saved it. I already saved it offline because I'm prepared. So when I open up the file, it's going to have the structure that I already need. Right. And so in this case, I had already trimmed this down because I said, you know what, I want to just update my office supplies budget. So I deleted the rows that I didn't want, which you can do, and Martus will not get mad at you. Right. And so here I've said, I want to update my office supplies budget, and I just want to quickly kick that out to Excel, make the changes, and import it back in. Right. So you have the flexibility to do that if that's what you want to do. It puts it in this format, which is exactly the format that you need to be able to make your changes. And so say that I wanted to make changes to these lines and just update them all. So I'm going to say this is 600 a month now. And all of these lines are going to be 600 a month. So that you don't have to sit here and watch me type these different numbers and try to get artificially creative. And then here I'll say this one's 5,000. So 5,000, if I want to put any notes in, about the amounts that I'm putting in for these periods, fine, those notes are there. Right. So all I do is update my numbers, save this file, and then literally turn around and just come back in and import the worksheet. I'm not saving it as CSV. I'm not doing any other machinations with it or reformatting it. Save that same thing, import it, and then once it picks up, there we go. I just hit import. And it's updated a bunch of different values for me, and that's done. So that's all it takes. They have an incredibly easy and simple import-export process. Now, if I were to look at my expenses, the office expenses that I just updated, we will see, and I'm going to filter it rather than scrolling. We will see the office expenses. These are the numbers, right, that I just had updated in my Excel sheet. So updated right away for me because I already had the format, so it was easy. So that's the ability to import data from an Excel file, should I choose to do that. And then last but not least here on the tab, a couple things. First is attachments. So each worksheet has the ability to have attachments to it, which you can specify. So if you want to attach something, maybe you want to attach a set of instructions for somebody on how they should be completing this worksheet. What better place to do that than right on the worksheet that they're going to be working on, right? So you could do that. Or if you did happen to import something and you wanted to attach some backup for that, you could do that here. You can drop multiple files here. So if I had something sitting in my downloads that I wanted to pull in as an attachment, let's say I pull this over, drop it, upload. I've now got something attached to my worksheet as backup. And then last but not least, truly this time, you'll see on the approvals what's happened. What is the state of this worksheet? So somebody submitted this worksheet to me and I wasn't happy. So I said, not feeling it, and I denied it. Right. So they could figure out what caused that mood and fix the worksheet and resubmit it, and maybe I'll approve it. Right. So, but that's what this tab does for you to see right away what the status is. And if you need to assign an approver on the fly, you could do that as well. So that is the worksheet, which is where the majority of your budgeting and planning type activity will happen. There is another section, which we're moving to now, for personnel budgeting. So Martus gives you a separate menu item to handle your personnel budgeting if you want to handle it this way. This ensures that sensitive data about salaries and such are kept super private, and personnel budgeting is an included module that has its own set of permissions. So it really helps to lock down those sensitive details about people's salary and benefits and so forth. Personnel budgeting lets you manage multiple scenarios, as one often wants to do in the planning cycle, especially when it relates to personnel. Think about when you're creating budgets for your own organization. Most of the time when I was a controller or CFO, I had multiple versions, and one of the key levers that differentiated those versions was different compensation increases, different hiring models, right? Some variation I needed to introduce related to personnel. Right? So that's what the personnel budgeting scenarios allow you to do. One thing to note about personnel budgeting right off the bat, it is extremely import friendly. So if you need to get stuff from your payroll system, you can import it. You need to bring in a bunch of employees or positions, you can import it. The templates are really easy to use, much like we saw earlier. But we're mostly going to look at just doing things in the UI for today. Just know that a lot of this stuff is importable if you need to do things more of an in bulk type of situation. So here I'm in my baseline scenario for my fiscal year budget. This is my default scenario here. It's my current scenario. It's what I'm working on right now. And you could see here, I've got a positions tab. This is where I budget for the different positions in my organization. Now you can see some of these positions are filled by employees. This position here is not. It's got a planned start date of September 1st. I haven't hired that person yet. Now that was actually true. I'd probably be in trouble because September 1st is almost around the corner, but we're in a pretend world where we're going to pretend that we're earlier in the year. Okay, so this person has not been hired yet. It's an open position that I need to hire, and so it's going in my budget. If I hit edit here next to this position, you're going to see that when I plan for a person within Martus, I can assign them a bunch of different pay types, which we configure during implementation. They're very easy to set up. So, this person's an hourly position. They're going to have FICA, they're going to have Medicare, they're going to have healthcare coverage of a certain type. And we also have a phone benefit, right? So I add to them the different pay types that are relevant for that position. Now, notice a lot of these say use as default, so I don't have to do anything. These pay types are configured to automatically be the right percentage, or to be the right amount for employee-only healthcare coverage, or to be the right amount for phone benefit. So I just add those pay types to their profile, and Martus takes care of assigning the correct amounts for me. The only thing I really need to specify most of the time is what their hourly rate is or their salary for the period. And the rest just pretty much flows. You'll also see here, if this position is occupied by an employee, I can assign the employee that is holding that position. I can assign them a type. Now, these position types are useful for grouping and reporting, and even for allocations, which we'll look at in a little bit. I can specify other information such as FTE, start end date, And then down here, these are the different dimensions that I'm using in my Martus environment. So this is going to be the default place where all of their compensation gets charged. Now, I do realize that most of the time when we charge people's compensation, especially in a nonprofit or professional services world, it's very unlikely that they're going to just one place, right? So we'll talk about allocations, which solves for that quandary in a moment. So if I look here at the detail tab, and I'm going to load this up, is an exhaustive breakout of how my personnel budget shakes out for my whole organization. So it's showing me the different positions, the employees who occupy them, if they're there, how they're being charged across dimensions, what GL account they're getting budgeted to, and the amount for each and every month, and then finally a total, right? So a very detailed breakout that I can study for how my personnel budget is shaking out. Now, it may look overwhelming, but keep in mind, if you're coming here and your intent is to look at a subset of the data, it's got that same pivotability that we're used to. So, maybe I only want to take a quick look at the executive director. Well, I can just filter to that position and I could see all the particulars of her comp. Or maybe I want to look at everybody that's in the accreditation department, right? So I can filter to that department, accreditation, load, there we go. Right. So that filterability is going to make it really easy to hone in on the pieces of the budget that I want to take another look at. Now, the permissions that I talked about before also apply here. So if we want to give somebody access to personnel budgeting, but they should only be looking at people who belong to their department, that extends into personnel budgeting. So if they're only allowed to see Department 120, they're only going to see people who belong to Department 120, and they can still do the planning for the people in their department so that you can decentralize that function if that's what you want to do. Right. So that's what the detailed tab does. It gives you an exhaustive detail. The summary tab gives you a much more condensed view, right? So it strips away the positions, the employee names, and it really just breaks it down and says, here's how the budget is broken out by dimension, by GL account. And it's a very simple view. This is what pushes over to your budget in the planner, right? So notice this is completely anonymized. So if I push this over to my budget, the planner is going to say, I've got one line for salaries for Department 110. Doesn't tell me who it is, just shows me that one line. That could be made up of 100 people or 3 people. But that's for people who have access to the details to know, and for everybody else to wonder. And then you'll see as well, that if I want to make changes, it's going to make it really easy, right? So for example, if I hop back to my detail grid here, maybe I want to give people an increase at some point during the year. Maybe I've done a all staff increase of 3%, let's say. So I want to raise everybody who is salaried exempt by 3%. What I could do to make that change without having to go into every person's profile and edit it is filter my pay type to salaried exempt, load that, and then just check this box over to the left and say update pay items. So maybe starting in July, I want them to go up by 3%, right? So I say start in July, it's going to be a 3% increase here and hit update. Notice that these amounts are going up in July, right? So just like that, that's all I had to do to make changes to my personnel budget for July. And then you'll also notice if I take away the filter for the pay type, that everything related went up along with it, right? So no extra work. Here in July, my salaries went up. So obviously, my related taxes went up, right? So automatically computed. I could push that over to the budget if I'm happy with it. Everybody's going to have their updated data. So that's the raise. Now, the other thing that I alluded to that happens a lot in nonprofit and professional services is we take people's comp and we allocate it. Okay, so it's not only in nonprofit, but especially in nonprofit, it is very common to see somebody's comp get split out 5 or 6 or 7 different ways for budgeting and reporting. Well, our little allocations tab over here lets us handle that. Okay. So if we take a look at the allocations and I hit edit, I've got some basically different allocation rules, which Martus refers to as allocation segments. Now, the allocation segment is basically a rule for how I'm allocating somebody's comp or a group of people's comp. You could see I can allocate these by the type of position here. I can allocate it by a department, right? Any of these triggers here, or I can allocate specific employees. So let's take a look at how I've allocated Mr. Affleck. And you'll see here, right, that if I want to see what I'm allocating, I simply look at show matches. So this is the comp I'm allocating. And then down in this grid, I could specify how his comp should be split out, right? So I could specify different percentages for every single month if I wanted to. And these are the worksheets that I'm sending it to, right? So I'm saying 65% of his time for this period of time goes to fundraising. Then it drops to 40, right? And other places pick it up. So this is very common for how we need to do things in a nonprofit or professional services world. We've got things that are funding sources that are coming up and coming down, and I need to be able to allocate across them. So this grid makes it very easy for me to specify the percentages that I should be splitting somebody. And again, I can plan this on the individual person level, or I can plan it on the position type level. I could plan it by pay type, by the different dimensions that I'm using. There's a good deal of flexibility there to get at what I want to allocate. And then once I've got these allocations set up, I can see within personnel budgeting what the effect of those allocations is. So if I come back to my summary, one way that I can do that is when I'm looking at this summary, I could say, I want to view this with an allocation. So show me these allocation rules and hit load. And it's automatically here now breaking out my comp based on those percentages that I entered, right? And so what I could do is say, show it with this allocation. And if I'm happy with this, this is what I push over to my budget in the planner so that people can have the comp allocated and they know how much they should be getting hit with in their program. If I want to see even more detail, this show allocation details actually shows me the ins and outs of the allocation. So it shows me, here's the allocation rule that put this comp there, or here's the allocation rule that took this comp out, right? So it shows me every single in and out if I really want to study it, if I'm that kind of person. They also have a nice report, which is relatively newer, called the allocation analysis. And that allocation analysis actually shows me, here's all my people, here's their comp, but I want to see what does that look like with this allocation rule set. So if I load this, now it shows me an allocation analysis by person. And I could see how their comp is broken out across all the different months. I could see it in dollar amounts, which is what I'm looking at now, or I could say, show me the percentage, right? So here I could see, these are the percentages of their comp that are hitting, all these different areas, period over period. So this is really helpful, especially for organizations that do a lot of splitting compensation between different programs or funding sources or projects. This report can really help you to understand how your comp has been split out and spot any areas that you might want to change. All right, so coming towards the end, I've got a couple more things to show you here. All right, so one thing I have to show you is financials. Right? And so as you remember from our slides, one of the pillars of a really good budgeting and planning system is that not only can you budget, but you can also do budget versus actual analysis on your data. So we're not looking to prepare budget data in a vacuum. We're looking to measure against it. Well, Martus has currently some fully pre-built reporting for your users to consume, and they're all subject to permissions just like everywhere else. So if I look at the dashboard section, I've got a menu that says financials. And here in the financials, there's a bunch of different pre-built reports that I can access. Right now, I'm looking at this year-to-date budget comparison report. And as you saw in all of the other things that we looked at, the same pivotability is there, right? So I could say, I want to look at this version of the budget. I want my rows to be projects. Right? I want my columns to be something else, right? So I can filter these things so that I could see project by project, what does this look like? I can also toggle on what's called this gain loss view. Right, and this gain loss view is just simply going to show me, is each project or grant or program or whatever making or losing money, right? Budget versus actual, right? So I could see that data really nice and summarized. And if I want to drill into any of the details, I can just click here on whatever I'm looking at, and it will take me to a separate financial report for whatever I just clicked on, right? So I can drill into all of those details. What's also nice is we take a look at this forecast report. This is one of the most common things that people want to see, is they want to see, let me just load this up so it's got a lot more data. They want to see a forecast, meaning I don't just want to know, where my organization is as of this moment. I want to know where it looks like we're going. So if I set my ending date here to, let's say we're in September 2021. What the forecast report does is it gives me actuals through my ending date, and then it gives me my budget for the rest, and then I have a total, right? So I could see, here's where I'm going to end up. Here's what my budget was. Am I over or under budget? Now, what's also good and helpful is, unlike other tools, when Martus brings in your actuals, they are bringing in ultra detailed actuals. So this is not just a plain number that you have to wonder what makes it up. If I click into consulting fees here, for example, when I drill into that number, Martus has synced in or imported in, depending on your accounting system, all of the detailed transactions. So whether somebody is a user, in this example, it was intact. So whether somebody's an intact user or not, they could still see all this detail in Martus, right? And if we give them permission to do so, if I'm storing my attachments inside of intact, I can also see the underlying attachment. So I know not only what is hit this line item, but if I want to look at this $2,500 and say, what was that bill? This little paperclip is actually syncing the attachments over from intact. So when I click this, it is going to open up for me the PDF, right? That was attached to that transaction. So I don't have to wonder, what is that? I'm going to see it right here. It gives me that attachment, right? So really helpful when you don't want to have a bunch of users in your accounting system and you want them to be able to access their underlying data and really have accountability, for the results of their program or their project or so forth. You'll also see a very helpful report to look at monthly budget comparison. So if you want to break it out month by month by month, what was my budget versus actual, that's built in. And then for a lot of nonprofit organizations like this one, a multi-year budget to actuals, right? So this is when you have those grants, which people often do, that maybe they're multi-year grants, or maybe your grant crosses a period that doesn't align with the calendar year or your organization's fiscal year. So you need to report on something that's crossing your natural fiscal year. Well, you can do that pretty easily. So let's say, for example, I have a grant that started in January 2021, and maybe it ends in June 2022. It's got a weird period. Well, I can load that up, and it's showing me now year over year what my actuals and budget are with a total here. Now I could easily filter this down. So let's say, I have this case with my grant 100. My grant 100 crosses this period. So this is what I want to look at. Now, if I'm a user who cares about grant 100 a lot, rather than having to come in and filter this every single time, I could say, let me add this as a saved report because I use this a lot. And I'll call this grant 100 BVA. I could choose to share it with other people if I am feeling generous, and I'll do that. And I'll say I'm going to create a new saved report. Right. So now I'm in my grant 100 budget versus actual. I could toggle right to other saved reports, but I don't have to filter every single time now. This is now preset to the way that I want it to be. And also on my welcome page, that's going to be one of those links that I could just jump right to my grant 100 budget versus actual. And as I drill into any one of these, it will show me what the numbers are, right? So if there's any actuals, any budgets, and so forth. Right, so lots of exploration of my data. If you are syncing data from your accounting system, which most people will be doing, On the dashboard is where you can access the updater, right? So if you have an accounting system that has a direct API integration with Martus, this updater is where you can go to make on-demand updates. Martus is already doing an automatic nightly sync without you having to do anything. But if you wanted to sync something on the fly, maybe you added a new GL account and you want it right now, you can go to the updater and just do push button, for whatever you've added, and it will queue up that sync for you right away. Same thing with the actuals. Maybe I've recorded new transactions for June and I did it today, so I want them available right away. I could just say sync my June again, right? And it will pull that data over from my accounting system. Another thing that you could do if you're using Intact, and I'm not sure if other accounting systems support this as well, but if you're using Intact, Martus can also push the budget back from Martus to Intact, right? So I could say I want this Martus budget to sync into this Intact budget and click upload, and it will sync that over so that you can use it in reporting on the Intact side. Not every accounting system supports pulling a budget in via the API. Intact definitely does, so that's one that you can do that. Last couple things around security, and I'll try to cover this quickly for you. I don't see anything in the Q&A yet, so please do feel free if there's anything you think of that you want to throw in there. So in terms of security, if we look at the users, you can add users to the environment and then you can permission those users. So if I hit edit next to my main user here, you'll see that my permissions here, I've got a role of admin, right? I could do everything, right? But you'll see here that I do have this granularity to say, what can this person do, right? So I can assign a role where maybe somebody doesn't have the ability to do anything and everything, and I can pick and choose what they have access to get into. Now, you'll see down here the notion of restricted accounts or drill down limited accounts. That means that for certain accounts, for example, if I look at my salaries type accounts, I've set them to drill down limited. So somebody can't drill into a number and see what's underneath, right? So that's a nice control if you don't want somebody getting into the details. In addition to that, you can control for each and every dimension in your environment, which of these does somebody have access to, right? So maybe I can only see these 3 departments. Maybe I can only see certain projects or grants, right? So every dimension, we have the ability to do that. Now, if I look at this, I'm going to hop over super quick to a more restricted user view in another browser. So here's my restricted user. Just to illustrate quickly the impact of those permissions, you'll notice as a restricted user, my menu choices are a lot more slimmed down, first of all, because I didn't give myself permissions to all these different things. You'll also notice if I look at my planner, I only have the worksheets for the departments that I should have. If I look at my financials and I'm trying to filter some data, I can only see the departments I'm allowed to see, right? So that's the impact, right, of being able to filter those things. Now, if I look at an income statement, last thing here, remember I set my personnel budget, my personnel accounts as drill down limited for this user. So if I try to drill into salaries because I'm curious, it's going to say, no, you don't have permissions to view the transactions in here. Right. So that is an example of the impact of the permissions. So we covered a lot. We went right up to the last second. More information when you get the slides. There is a new report builder coming out in Martus. It's going to be in beta soon, right? So you'll be able to see this video to look at more information on the new report builder, which has even more reporting functionality than what we saw today. If anyone has questions about Martus, about anything else, please feel free to contact me anytime. You can scan this QR code here on the slide to pull my contact info as well. Always happy to help. Thank you for making the time to attend the webinar today and hope to hear from you soon.